The king looked into the furnace once more, and what he saw left him speechless. There were not 3 men in the fire anymore. There were 4. The king stared into the furnace in disbelief. He knew exactly how many men had been thrown into the fire, and it was certainly not 4. The mysterious figure seemed to shine with a heavenly presence, standing among the flames as though the fire itself could not touch him. Even more astonishing, the 3 Hebrews were not screaming or trying to escape. They were calmly walking through the furnace. The flames that should have destroyed them had somehow lost their power. The faces of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego showed no fear. Their expressions were peaceful and calm. It was as if they knew they were not alone in the middle of the fire. Nebuchadnezzar could no longer remain seated. The mighty king who had ordered their execution suddenly stood in amazement. Everything he believed about power and authority was being challenged before his very eyes. The king's officials hurried closer to see for themselves. They expected to witness destruction, but instead they found a miracle. No one could explain what was happening inside the furnace. The mysterious 4th figure remained beside them, surrounded by fire yet untouched by it. Throughout history, many believers have wondered who this person was. Whatever the answer, his presence transformed a place of death into a place of safety. Finally, the king could remain silent no longer. He stepped forward and called out to the 3 men, inviting them to come out of the furnace. His voice no longer carried anger, but amazement and respect. To everyone's astonishment, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. They walked out exactly as they had walked in alive, unharmed and completely at peace. A wave of shock spread through the crowd. Moments earlier, everyone had expected these men to perish. Now they stood before them as living evidence that something extraordinary had happened. Then the people noticed something even more incredible. There was not even the smell of smoke on their clothing. The fire had left absolutely no trace behind. The king who had once threatened them now looked upon them with deep respect. He realized that he had witnessed a power far greater than his own. Before the entire crowd, Nebuchadnezzar praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He declared that their God had rescued his faithful servants from the flames. The crowd could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. A furnace that was hot enough to kill soldiers had failed to harm these 3 men. Everywhere people looked, faces were filled with shock and amazement. The officials whispered among themselves, trying to understand the miracle. No explanation could satisfy them. They knew that something greater than human power had taken place before their eyes. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood quietly before the king. They did not boast about what had happened. Instead, their calm expressions reflected a deep trust in the God who had delivered them. For the first time, Nebuchadnezzar spoke to them with genuine respect. The king who had once threatened their lives now recognized the greatness of the God they served. The furnace still burned behind them, a reminder of what had nearly happened. Yet it had become a symbol of something entirely different, a testimony of faith, courage, and divine protection. Then the king made a public declaration before the entire kingdom. He acknowledged that no other god could rescue people in such an extraordinary way. Messengers soon carried the news throughout Babylon. The story of the fiery furnace spread from city to city, and people everywhere heard about the miracle. In marketplaces and homes, people spoke about the 3 men who had walked through fire and survived. The miracle became one of the most talked about events in the kingdom. Away from the crowds, the 3 friends gave thanks to God. They had trusted Him even when death seemed certain, and now they stood together, grateful for His faithfulness. Their friendship had been tested in the most difficult of circumstances. Together they had chosen faith over fear, and together they had witnessed a miracle that would never be forgotten. As the sun rose over Babylon the next morning, the kingdom was no longer the same. A new story was being told, a story about faith that could not be burned and a God whose power could not be denied. Wherever the 3 men went, people looked at them with amazement and respect. They had become living witnesses to the power of the God they served. Their story reminds us that true faith does not depend on easy circumstances. Real faith remains strong, even when the fire grows hotter and the outcome seems uncertain. The furnace that had been prepared to destroy them became the very place where God's power was revealed. What their enemies meant for harm became a testimony that inspired an entire kingdom. The story of the fiery furnace continues to inspire people thousands of years later. It reminds us that even in our darkest trials, we are never alone. And sometimes, in the middle of the fire, we discover that God has been walking beside us all along.